Let me say that I'm very happy to be here. And even though I'm a northerner, I was born and raised in New York. My mother was from Alabama, my father's from Georgia. And so that means that I have something called home training. So I know that you're supposed to acknowledge your hosts when you are in their presence. So I wanted to say thank you to the staff of the Carter Library here that has done such tremendous work in arranging this. And we go give them a round of applause. Thank you. Absolutely. And in particular, Meredith Evans. And I'd be remiss without mentioning my good friend Khalil Chisholm, who actually brought me here. It was the first time I ever spoke here. He was responsible for it. And so I'm back here. When Khalil calls and asks you to do something, you kind of have to do it. So I actually had another thing that I was supposed to do, and I canceled it because Khalil asked me to do that. So I'm happy to see kind of friends and family here today. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I know you all are looking forward to participating as well. And they told me to make sure that you write your questions down on here. If you have questions, we'll have a little bit of time to get to them at the end. So if you write them down, someone will come and collect them. And then you have the kind of lottery shot at getting your question asked, and we'll do our best to answer it. And so let me introduce the participants in this conversation today. I'm very fortunate to have this good panel of contributors here. To my left is Karin Ryan, and she's a senior policy advisor. She works with former President Jimmy Carter and Mrs. Rosalind Carter on a range of issues, including assisting their efforts on behalf of victims of human rights violations through personal interventions with heads of state. She's represented the center in many international negotiations, including the International Criminal Court, the Human Rights of Women, the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, and most recently the establishment of a UN Human Rights Council, and has worked closely with the UN Office of the High Commission for Human Rights to organize expert consultations designed to strengthen the role of the OCH HR within the United Nations system. On the end here, we have Lisa Williams, who has a very kind of succinct opening statement to her biography, and I think this is a great line. It says, "Lisa Williams is a survivor. She understands what it's like to be held at gunpoint, to be demeaned, and be called unprintable names, to be afraid in her own skin, to be repeatedly violated and tortured, and then be blamed for it all. She endured many years of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Abandoned and homeless at age 12, Lisa did what she had to do to survive on the streets and determined very early on that attitude is everything. It has been that belief that helped her turn tragedy into triumph, obstacles into opportunities, and challenges into channels of hope for herself and countless others. To change the trajectory of her life, Lisa pursued her formal education, which today includes a Bachelor of Science degree from Campbell University, a Master's of Arts in Human Resource Development from Bowie State University, and a logistics certificate in petroleum surveillance engineering from the United States Army. On her journey to wholeness and healing from years of traumatic events, Lisa developed an unwavering passion for the empowerment of women and youth, particularly those who have faced sexual abuse and exploitation. And just in the center here, we have a panelist who I'm passingly familiar with, Ms. Ouleye Ndoye, who is a doctoral candidate and scholar at Columbia University. Just randomly, because of the way the world works, it seems like not very many years ago at all, I was a professor at Spelman College, and a very serious first-year student popped into my office and said, "I'm told you're my advisor." And that was Ms. Ndoye, and she's gone on to be, that's what I remember her as the most serious first-year student I've ever met. And she's gone on to do wonderful things since then. In addition to being a doctoral candidate at Columbia, she is a Richard Hofstadter Fellow, focusing her studies on African history. She's a native of upstate New York, and the recipient of the Weidenfeld Scholarship and Leadership Program Award to attend the University of Oxford, where she received her Master's in Migration Studies. And finally, we have Kurt Young, who is the associate professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Clark Atlanta University. And he's originally from Belize City, grew up in New Jersey and Tampa, Florida. He attended the University of Florida, where he received his undergraduate degree in history, his master's in African and African American studies, and his PhD in political science in 2002. So we have this wonderful, distinguished panel, and I kind of want to jump into it really quickly so we can kind of get to the substance of this conversation. I wonder how you all, if you could talk a little bit about how you all came to have your individual passions, your passions for individual freedom, and the concerns that we're really here to talk about today. Are y'all gonna do that? Are y'all one of those channels that starts like, do I have to like start calling on people? Okay, how about we start with Karin and then kind of go down
Good.
here.
Sure, we wouldn't want to presume to jump in and be first. Well, thank you, Professor Cobb, also Dr. Cobb, and to all of you. I don't know, it's going to be hard to follow that session earlier. It was so beautiful and sweet and just wonderful. I'm lucky to have been here for a very long time. I won't say how long, because then you're going to look at me and go, really? But I've been here a long time and came up, started as a very enthusiastic volunteer, actually, and ended up working on individual cases of human rights violations. And then I got to work with President and Mrs. Carter. And I had lived overseas. I'd lived in Zaire, now in the Congo, and understood how important it was what President Carter achieved with putting human rights at the front of foreign policy. So I think for today's conversation, I think what I'm feeling the urge to think about, to talk about, is to build on what the conversation was that they had, which was, where are we on our journey for human rights? Because civil rights, as we understand it, is very specific to participation, access to participation in civic life. But human rights, as Malcolm X told us, was a broader concept, that we have to see each other as human beings. And there is a way to enshrine that respect for each other in global norms, in the idea of human rights, that we are equal human beings. And we have in recent years been looking at the rights of women, because not only that we have strong women and President Carter and Mrs. Carter feel strongly about it, but this is an area where human beings, half of the planet, are actually not full human beings in the way we live. Even in this country, we never were able to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Women in this country do not enjoy the equal protection of law. And so when we have victims of violence, they are not protected by the law in the same way that men are. We have a situation where women's bodies are commodified in a way where we've normalized violence against women through what we want to call sex work and prostitution, like it's just some other job. Really? Or the abuse of women. So this is what we began to realize, is that we've got to think of human rights and boil it down to specific things like access to voting, but also access to equal protection of the law. So this is sort of what we have been up to here with the leadership of President Carter and our CEO, Marianne Peters, who's here, is really putting that front and center. And President Carter talked about his book on this that he wrote 2 years ago, and it's been a major part of what we're doing, and delighted that others are on the panel giving attention to that issue as well.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you to the Carter Center. I'd like to echo Dr. Cobb in thanking Meredith and Khalil for having us here. To answer your question, my initial entry, I think, into the field of human rights came about during a semester studying abroad. I was a student at Spelman majoring in international studies, and they required that we go abroad for a semester, which seemed a bit daunting. So I chose Senegal, where my father is from. I hadn't been since the 90s when I was quite young, and so it was my first time returning as an adult. And we went on a tour of a slum, and it wasn't far in distance from where my grandparents lived, probably 10-15-minute ride, but definitely a part of town I would have never seen had I not been with the university there. And from there, I was curious and sort of sparked a series of applications to different fellowship programs for research. And I was fortunate to travel and work in the Middle East, in Israel, on issues with African refugees, primarily from Sudan and the DRC. And as a Henry Luce Foundation scholar in Southeast Asia, I was based in Thailand on the Burmese border and on the Lao border, where human sex trafficking is a huge problem. And a few other jobs and fellowships around the world, I was able to see how the definition of human sometimes is actually the real root of the problem when you're talking about human rights. Whose rights are we protecting? And in cases, for example, like Thailand, oftentimes the people most often trafficked are young girls from hill tribes. They're not citizens, they don't have any paperwork, so they're not protected by the state, and they're not considered human. And I think you could apply that to pretty much every situation, whether it's refugees without paperwork or people living in poverty here in the United States or in Atlanta. As President Carter pointed out earlier, Atlanta is a huge center for sex trafficking, and we have some experts here on the city, but we're 75, 85, and 20 split. You have the north and south of the United States, east and west cut together here. And human sex trafficking in a global sense comes right through Atlanta quite easily, as you have people from Southeast Asia brought in through the Mexican border with Texas and up and throughout the different highways and byways throughout our cities. So once I realized that the things I worked on abroad were very much an issue right here at home, sparked my interest to continue this work.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And I want to start by saying how wonderful it is to share the stage with Dr. Cobb. I've admired your work from afar, and I appreciate the opportunity, as well as my other fellow panelists. I appreciate this question, because the question gives me an opportunity to, in a sense, venerate my ancestors. Your question is an easy question for me to answer, because, in a sense, it chose me, as I'm sure we could all relate to that. It's really a function of my family. My position here is a function of my family, both in the distant sense. I remember, and you mentioned my birthplace, Belize City, Belize. I remember vividly coming to the realization that I belonged to a family that had a very direct personal connection to one of the most active and respected chapters of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the organization that was started by Marcus Garvey and others. He didn't do it alone, of course. And so I began to understand that Garveyite phenomenon in a different kind of way. Of course, there are all types of interpretations and approaches, but at the core of that movement was the uplift of people of African descent all over the planet. And so I related to that, I connected to that. And secondly, I was able to connect to it and then come to where I am now through an understanding and the application of that type of history and those type of experiences to the community that I'm from. I came of age in Jersey City, New Jersey, and Tampa, Florida. Anyone connected to those places? Tampa, Florida, and particularly a distressed but beautiful part of that city called the Robles Park area. And when I graduated from college and continued with my subsequent degrees, I and the rest of my family remained grounded and connected to the dynamics of that community. So although I'm here in Atlanta or different parts of the country, we maintained a connection to the community and became a very active part of the efforts to address the challenges of those communities. So both in the context of, again, this Garveyite tradition and in the broader effort to understand and eradicate all of those isms that make life difficult for human beings to be human. It's really a part of the fabric. And again, I can't take credit for it. It chose me.
Mm-hmm. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It was April 5th, 2007, when I saw the article in our local newspaper that said, "The selling of Atlanta's children." It could have said, "The selling of America's children." Here I was sitting on my farm, gated farm, very privileged life, thinking, this is a misprint. We cannot be selling our children. On that newspaper was a picture of the child who was being charged with the act of prostitution. She was 10 years old. She was an American child, a full citizen of America. And she stood there alone being charged with an act. She was charged with the crime that had been committed against her. There was something wrong with that. And I didn't know what to do except to get on the phone to call people, because you cannot see an injustice like that and sit still and be okay in your spirit. So it came to me, not from my past, but in the present time that we're sitting in 2007. Today, our work centers around the social determinants that renders our children vulnerable to this and to predators. We have worked in the space of direct services, training, and education, and have come full circle, because if we don't dismantle the social determinants, those issues that bring them to that point of being lured and recruited, then we have done nothing.
I want to return to this question about civil and human rights, and I think this is kind of an open-ended question, but I think you all have a unique perspective on this. We've seen, historically, lots of images that we can call to mind, images from slavery, images from the civil rights movement, in which people are completely unaware of the humanity of the people whom they are oppressing. And I wonder if these struggles are somehow different, if there's a reason that we haven't learned these lessons. Have we made progress? Is it more difficult to convey that message now, in 2016? Because it seems almost as if this would be like kind of a relic of a different era, but we don't have the fundamental understanding of what makes a person a human being, what connects us as common individuals.
So I think part of President Carter sort of pitched to this issue a little earlier when he talked about the normalization of violence. And I think part of the problem is that violence is so prevalent in our culture. We have absorbed it as a normal type of behavior. So whether it's in the family, on the schoolyard, in our communities, in our faith communities, in our foreign policy, that the act of violence seems like normal. And even if so there's two questions. First, there's dehumanization and the degree to which you feel entitled to use violence against other people. And then the second level of that is the fact that violence itself is okay. And so I think in order for us to be so okay with violence to a certain degree, we have to dehumanize other people. And what President Carter said earlier, that we're always better than someone else. I'm better than another race. I'm better than another gender, et cetera. And something has set in, I think, in our culture that allows us to do that. And we see the spikes in violence. Although wars between countries and the number of people dying in wars have gone down, individual violence is ever present. And so this is what I think about, is like, how do we face that normalization of violence, and then what do we do about it? How do we bring, and I do think faith communities play a particularly important role. And someone told me recently that pornography is very widely abused in their church community, and that this was uncovered, and I thought, if this is so pervasive and it's so acceptable when that is such a violent, especially now, it's become extremely violent. You see how even our 12-year-old boys have access to it, and our children. It's sort of infecting our ability to see other people as dignified and equal, et cetera. So I think that our faith communities must grapple with this, because this is where moral leadership, and we're in the South, so we can say that. In New York City, it's harder to talk about the role of religion, but here we are in the South.
I grew up in New York City,
Yeah.
in a very religious community.
Okay, so I take it back. I take it back. In policy circles, it's awkward, but I do think that's important.
Your question brings to mind a speech given by Amilcar Cabral, I want to say in 1966 in Havana. And Cabral, in this speech, made reference to the necessity for any movement to advance. It had to resolve the internal contradictions. And to the extent that those internal contradictions were not resolved, then you will have a continuation of problems such that a particular kind of movement would not succeed in this effort. So let's expand on that and apply it to this national project that we see here in these United States of America. So there has been this discussion, a conversation in a sense, about freedom and human rights. But there needs to be, I think, a conversation about the conversation. All right, that gets to one of our internal contradictions, which is this capacity, and I think it came out in President Carter's comments early on in his interview, where we almost have this juxtaposition of being able to proclaim with pride the values, the exceptionalism that define, again, this American experience, right? And at the same time, refuse to grapple with the contradictions that defy those proclamations that we make about ourselves. That I see as a contradiction. And that is a contradiction that runs so deep, it continues, and I think it continues to flow such that it will prevent us from grappling with the problem that I think your question suggests. So when we, and I guess that we'll get to this in some kind of way, I don't want to spend too much time here, but when we just now begin to reflect on the experience with the first African-American president of the United States. Right? There was an opportunity there to have a different kind of discourse. But the tendency was to proclaim on the one hand that we had entered into a post-race society, or on the other hand, there was the unleashing of a kind of racial tension that resulted in many ways the dehumanizing of this person who is the holder of the most powerful seat in the world. And so what I would suggest is that part of our difficulty in grappling with that problem is in the very way that we choose or choose not to. I would add one last point. President Carter made a point earlier where he made mention of the progress. I would argue that one of the motive forces behind the progress is when we have these conversations about our conversation, the way we talk about freedom, the way we talk about injustice, the way we talk about race. And when we have those conversations forced to the forefront in some kind of way, whether it's through a, quote, civil rights movement or some other type of movement, or whether it's through a coming to reckon with some kind of contradiction in the society, broader contradiction, it forces us to move forward. At the same time, I think when we relinquish those opportunities to have a very serious look in the mirror, and a very serious dialogue where we're not afraid to deal seriously with the problems that we see, and again, grappling with those contradictions, I think we continue to face those stingy and those very strong and staunch problems that we've been struggling with as a country from the beginning.
Can I interject this thing here? As a question, you can feel free to respond to the previous one, but I wanted to ask, it occurs to me that to ask, what is it from kind of previous movements that have addressed these issues, that have grappled with these concerns, do we think is useful? And are there lessons from previous movements that we haven't learned? And are there things maybe that are different, that we have kind of completely novel challenges that we have to confront? I want to hear from Ouleye, since she's a former student, I can actually call on her. And actually left out, it says Ouleye Ndoye Warnock. I left out her new surname, so.
Well, I think what everyone's touching on is this process of othering. And when you remove the sense of identity and say, well, this person's not like me because we don't share the same citizenship, or this person's not like me because we don't share the same gender. I'm not like that person because they're poor and they live over on that side of the tracks, and I don't go over there, so I don't see them. It's easy to create this invisibility, and I don't think there's anything new about it or anything unique or exceptional to Americans in this process. It happens, I mean, as a historian, I thought you were going to call on me because I was a historian, and I thought you were a former student.
Well, you were a former student in the history department, so
Okay. Nice
it was
save.
implicit.
So, you know,
See, she was like this as a first-year student, seriously.
Do it.
But yeah, seriously, you do see this happening in different sectors and different time frames. And I think the way to kind of try to bridge that disconnect, and I was having a conversation with somebody who raises money towards work to empower women and children quite recently, and it's difficult. Universities have an easier time raising money to build a new stadium than organizations that are really serving the least of these, and you have to ask yourself, why is that? I think people, connect with the idea of seeing their name on the doorway into the water fountain, like a part of the basketball court, but not with sending money, even across town, let alone overseas, to work on things that nobody really wants to talk about. They're not pretty issues. They're not proper table conversation a lot of the time. And, you raised the point about pornography in churches and this being uncovered. This isn't the kind of thing, maybe it comes too close to home for some people in their own vices, or maybe it's just something that, they want to pretend doesn't happen in their town. So a lot of times it might be harder for domestic organizations to coalesce a community towards their goals, because it's easier to say, well, that happens, in Thailand, but not here in Atlanta. It's a little bit different here, but it's really not that different. So I think getting people, one, to step out of their comfort zones, and whether it's taking a tour of different part of town or a different neighboring state, let alone if you go overseas, do you really want to take time off the beach to go and visit an orphanage and see what the struggles are and how you can help? Because sometimes it's something as simple as $20 that a girl needs a birth certificate, just the paperwork processed, so that she can enroll in school. And that $20 that you would have spent in 2 or 3 days at Starbucks could go a long way towards allowing someone's whole entire life outlook to be different. So.
Lisa?
I think the then is very much connected to the now. I look at our movement and where we've come from since 2007. We started because of an injustice for a little girl who was 10 years old. We shared that rhetoric, much like they did in the civil rights era of the 60s, with everyone we could come into contact with in community, on our jobs. And then they rallied with us. And then there were hundreds of us speaking on behalf of that child who was once voiceless. And then we took that voice and we went to legislatures and we said laws must be changed. And there wasn't just 1, 2, 3, 4. There were thousands of us across this state of Georgia. And that moved us to work in concert with people we would normally not work in concert with. We worked in concert with men and Republicans and Democrats and independents and people who didn't think like us but knew that there was an injustice, and together we could do something that would change this state and the dignity of those children who were being bought and sold in our communities. And that materialized on May 5th, 2015, with the governor here signing the historic Safe Harbor Rachel's Law into Act. That's a direct correlation back to the 60s and the civil rights movement. We just took a page book because we didn't have to reinvent that, right? And when that happened on May 5th, 2015, I looked at the young woman who that bill is now named after. And it was one of those moments in history for me, because across the nation, I can say this because I have traveled and done this work across the nation, most people dismiss girls of color and black girls when we talk about this issue of sex trafficking as if this was their lot in life. And so therefore, they do not matter. And we're entitled to do what we want with them because they do not matter. They are insignificant, they are invisible, and they are generally voiceless, and they never get a place at the table. And so on May 5th, 2015, when Governor Dell signed the Safe Harbor Rachel's Law into Act, it was named after a young African-American girl. It's the only bill in America named after a living African-American woman. Huge. Huge. And so we didn't reinvent, we just have this modern day slavery, is what we call it. It's what our president called it, that we are dealing with. And we deal with it because these are our children in our state and in our country. my youngest baby that was called, that I had a call in from was 7 years of age. So for us to look only overseas is unacceptable when we have things going on in our own backyard. So the then is very much a part of the now.
I wondered if you all could talk about social media and how this has impacted the work that you do. If it's facilitated it, if there are things in social media that make this work more difficult, what the net balance of it is.
Yeah, I'm struggling with that right now. I'm almost hesitant to answer this question because I can't claim to be immersed enough in social media to get it quite right. At the same time, I'm seeing some trouble signs. You asked a question a moment ago with regard to the applicability or the transfer, my words, not yours, of some previous period of struggle or movement. And so I think that there are some aspects of movement that belong to a particular point in history that stays there. Although I agree with the point, you can apply some aspects to the challenges that present themselves, especially when it is a result of a clear understanding of the conditions on the ground, the zeitgeist, and the extent to which those actual mechanisms apply. What I'm afraid of is an almost uncritical assumption that social media has replaced those previous mechanisms without a serious discussion of, again, what are the conditions that we are trying to grapple with, and what are the goals that we are trying to achieve, what realities are we trying to transform. And the answers to those questions determine the instruments and the mechanisms. It's sort of like I had a conversation with a student of mine, and he helped clarify what I'm struggling with. Whether you are cooking with an old wood stove or cooking with a microwave, which symbolizes increased technology, you still have to know how to cook, right? The goal is still to nourish oneself. In other words, the goal is not to arrive at the use of a microwave just for the sake of using the microwave technology. The technology becomes an instrument for something. And I'm afraid that if we're not careful, and again, this is a humbling comment because I haven't immersed myself in it yet, but I know how to text and email, but that's about it. I'm still struggling with the Twitter and the other machine, right? But that's my concern, Jelani. I don't want us to gravitate towards what's easy because it's there and at our fingertips, literally, because there's still, depending on, again, the concreteness, we have to make those decisions of the proper instruments based on the realities. And I'm not sure if we're having those conversations. Maybe it's our challenges in the kind of intergenerational transfer of technology, intergenerational transfer of movement that we have that conversation, and maybe it's our fault or previous generations' fault for not having this dialogue with our young people and those who proclaim to use social media in the context of movement. Maybe they're just reaching out and grabbing what's there in the absence of that discussion. But I still think we have to have that discussion, otherwise we'll be repeating ourselves again.
I think the nice thing about social media is that it allows issues that might not be picked up, for example, by the mainstream news channels to be spread and discussed. And that's the biggest impact that I see, especially on these issues that, like I was saying, nobody really wants to talk about. I mean, now if you turn on the news, all you're really going to hear about is Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And if you're like me, sometimes you just want to put that on mute. And it's easier to go over to social media and see what else is happening in the world and what else is happening in our state that is not being covered because it's not getting as many ratings. And so it puts the news outlet in the power of people and activists and, you know, to your point, younger people, which Carter said there won't be any change without. So
That's right.
Karin, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I think that I agree that we have to know what it is we're after so that we can decide how to use the tools available. And I think this is where we may be a little lost because the norms and the ideas and who are we is, I think, confused. So Van Jones put out a video yesterday saying, you know, FDR mastered the radio and got the public. JFK mastered the TV and got the public. And Donald Trump has mastered social media and is accelerating with using this. It was a really good point, I thought, because I think there's a caution that we can't dismiss it. We can't dismiss its power. We know that ISIS and Daesh and these groups are using it very effectively, so we can't be naive about it. We have to know it, we have to understand it and how to use it. I think we do have to understand, though, that the civil rights movement succeeded because they had a strategy. They had meetings, they had people meeting face to face, saying, okay, Tuesday we're doing this, Sunday we're doing that, and people were all in. And this is the part, I think we get lazy. We send out a tweet or, and even the Arab Spring, it was a Facebook revolution. Well, it's sort of, something has to accompany this use of the technology. We have to be thinking together about strategy. What is our goal and how do we get there? And it can be an accelerant for good or ill. We better figure out how to use it for good, because if we don't, people are using it for ill.
We're talking about the future of the movement here, and I wanted to just, I guess, ask a foundational question, which is, what about this work in kind of intangible senses? What about this work makes you hopeful? If you're trying to appeal to people, say, this is what you should do, what is it you see that gives you that hope that things can change and that the progress can be made?
Well, I see hope every day when I look in my girl's eyes. I see it in the girl who was being sold on the Cheshire Bridge 2 years ago, who just graduated double major with a 3.5 from Middle Georgia State University. I see it when my girls are accepted at Mercer and Kennesaw State University. I see it when my 2 girls were invited to the United Nations, the 59th Commission on the Status of Women, to speak before women all over the world, the globe. And they stand up there, and they do not go in their victimization, but they go in their power. I see that hope. I see that hope when my girl says to me, I didn't do it right this time, but I'll do it right next time. I'm not giving up. I see it when we've rescued 13 boys and they said, thank you for rescuing us, even though we're not a girl, that you saw us. I see it when we'll go to the polls this November on November 8th, and we have the opportunity to vote for Senate Resolution 7, the funding mechanism, the constitutional amendment here in Georgia that will fund the services and the resources for children who have been victims of human sex trafficking. That's hope for me. It's hope for me when my baby girl says, I have a job, Ms. Williams, and no one is tricking me out anymore. And when the FBI says there's something different about your girls, we have taken girls to many programs, but there's something different about the girls that have come through Living Water. They hold their heads a little different. They stand a little taller. They don't get it all right, none of us do, but they keep trying. There's something that gives me hope about that. It gives me hope that we're having this conversation and we're going to really perhaps walk out thinking a little differently, that race matters when we talk about human trafficking, that services are given and withheld because of a girl's race or her age. If she's 18, she's no longer a child, and she should have known better. I have hope that we in this room can change that, that when we see a victim, we treat them with the resources and services that they need, but we don't allow them or we make them stay in their victimization, that we become that bridge to help them to become a survivor and next a thriver. That's where my hope is in this whole piece.
Beautiful.
I want to build on this because I think you've pointed to something extremely important. We have to have hope in the work that you're doing, and because it's almost like it's the thing that nobody wants to talk about, right? And there are this great work that you are doing and others to provide services to people who are trapped in what we can call slavery, right? And there are whole jurisdictions where they have adopted a comprehensive approach. In Sweden, they passed a law 15 years ago that sees people who are trapped in the sex trade, child or adult.
That's right.
And says, we know that this would not be a choice that any person would make if they had other options, right? And so we are going to provide housing and childcare and job training because this is something we recognize, okay? But we're also going to hold men, because it's 99% men who buy, so just in case you think I'm using the word man carelessly, not hold the men who buy accountable with stiff penalties, traffickers and pimps, but we're also going to educate the public on the inherent harms of prostitution and trafficking. They're doing that in Sweden. They just passed the law in France. They've passed the law in Canada. They're doing a version of this in Seattle and Cook County. And for me, that's hope, because there is another trend where people are saying, well, sex work, it's cool. It's just another way to make a living. And I'm afraid that young people, I've heard that there's a movement in New York City for students, college students, to legalize prostitution because so they can pay their tuition. And I understand that some people will put this forward as empowering, et cetera, and I get that. I get that that's part of what's part of the new cultural moment of self-determination, but I think it's very misguided, because if we legalize this whole thing, just imagine how many human bodies, mostly girls and women, will have to be supplied to an endless marketplace, right? This is sex we're talking about. Right? So this is actually a thing that's happening right now, and the hope that I have is that places like Sweden and Cook County and Atlanta, where this is being tried, are showing a different way, that we can help people, we can give people what they, without treating them as sort of like, oh, they don't know their own mind or something, but to really say, no, as a society, we're not just going to give in to this, as if this has always been, it's the oldest profession, so oh well, we better just accept it. This is actually a thing happening right now that we have to get informed about, and your work gives me hope, because then I can say to people who are skeptical that look at this amazing work that's being done to actually give girls and women an option, that they don't have to do that. So thank you for that.
I think we have about 5 minutes before we go to, a little bit less actually, before we go to the audience questions. So if you haven't passed them up, please do so now. Ouleye and Kurt, could we get you in on this really quick?
Yeah, please.
I was just going to add that, you know, the economy behind this is a big piece of the issue, so it's important to look at the interconnectedness of a lot of the things that we vote on, such as raising minimum wage and providing other employment opportunities, so that young girls don't feel like this is a viable means to pay tuition, because there may be another option available. And I mean, likewise, I am inspired by the work that organizations like yours do, and even more so would like to see there not be as much of a need for so many organizations like that. And I think the real way in which you can alleviate the pressure for organizations to pop up and save and recuperate and rehabilitate young girls and boys is for there to be other opportunities. And keeping kids in school is a huge piece of that, which is why all of the organizations always emphasize a component on staying in school education, helping girls finish at least K through 12, then hopefully go on to college. And even, you know, you've talked about some of your girls I know have graduated and gone on for higher education as well. Just all these opportunities raise their ability to earn, and that can really change the entire landscape.
That's a great point. I was thinking about a famous quote by Frantz Fanon in his book, Wretched of the Earth, where he says that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, realize its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. The question is an easy question. It's easy to drift towards the easy answer to that question, which is I'm inspired by the young folk who are taking their own lives in their hands, and they're seizing the time, and they're trying to make the world anew. But the reality is that young people always do that. Right? That's one of the, we talk about motive forces of movement, or the intergenerational transfer of movement. Young folk always. We are here today and enjoying the kind of experiences that we enjoy because young people at some point chose to make a difference, right? So I was struggling to not give an easy answer like that, right? I reflected a little bit on Cabral's point, Fanon's point, and what we saw taking place, if you will, if you can, and this may just be in my mind, but what I see when I look at a juxtaposition between Jenna in the 1990s, or the movement or the young people who begin to galvanize around the Jenna 6, and Ferguson, what I think I see was, well, let's say it like this. One of the differences between those two reactions was that it didn't take long for what occurred around the Jenna 6 to be absorbed by an older generation of leadership who began to articulate for the young folk who were organizing exactly what they were trying to say. And in the process of doing so, they missed, I think, what the young people were saying in Jenna. What we see occurring, in my mind, and I guess we all saw this play out in front of our very eyes, was that the young people who began to organize in Ferguson took a very careful note to say, not this time. In a sense, we got this. Right? And of course, it made some of our leadership in the civil rights community kind of nervous, right? Because they weren't used to being told to, sit down and move out of the way. But certainly, young people in Ferguson and other types of responses to some of the dynamics that we see unfolding in front of our eyes, I think they demonstrated a certain level of courage, which said that we are prepared to proclaim for ourselves that this is our movement and it's our time. And that's what I think gives me hope. Not that young people are moving, because again, to kind of complete the circle, young people are always moving, they're always responding in some kind of way to challenge what they see to be the distasteful or injustices of their time. But what I think I see happening now is that they're prepared to do so with a certain sense of courage, a certain sense of clarity, even while in the process of figuring it out, right? Because, of course, all generations, and that's the essence of, I think, Fanon's point, out of relative obscurity, which means they have to figure it out themselves. And that's what I think is the beautiful expression that gives me most hope.
Well, I think there are questions. Oh, from an online person. So I think in the interest of time, maybe we can have one person, so we can get as many questions as possible, one person respond to each question. And the question we have here is, do Black lives matter? What does civil rights look like today for a community that people believe are now equal?
Well, I guess I'll just take a shot at that because it kind of flows, I think, from the point I was trying to make. I think what's happening, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is getting unfortunately is experiencing an unfortunate treatment right now. I think it's, for the right reasons, there is a rush to compare them to a movement of another period. And because people are hungry for some kind of new type of energy to help to transform and help to continue the need to transform a particular challenge in the society. And some would argue that movements such as Black Lives Matter is well overdue. Right? But I think that we have to give them time to begin to complete the maturation of themselves as a movement. We talk about the civil rights movement as if it was some kind of monolithic movement that just dropped out of the sky and changed the world and left, right? No, it's a movement, even our beginning point, at least our conscious beginning point, where we like to begin in the 1950s. Well, we forget that there was such a thing called a March on Washington movement, right? We forget that we had all types of expressions of civil rights, some very, very famous and some very obscure. All right? We know that some of those movements were absorbed into other more popularly known movements, but this civil rights phenomenon and struggle is a very old phenomenon. And it took time to get to the point where, indeed, it had the power to transform the world. And we have to give this Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's an unfair question. Well, I respect the question, and I don't want to disrespect the question, because I think it's an important question. But I think the tendency to rush, there is a tendency to rush to a comparison that I don't think is ripe yet. Yeah. Let's give them some time.
Karin, Most people think they can't engage in human rights in their everyday lives. How can you guide us to be more involved in our thinking about thinking about and advocating for human rights?
In their everyday lives. So, great. Gives me a chance to plug some good work that's going on. First of all, you have to think in your own life. You have to, if you want to be involved in human rights, the first thing to do is to find something you care about, that you personally care about and you know would get you up on a Saturday morning to go do. And then really learn about that issue and invest the time and figure out who are the other organizations working and go and get involved. We are actually in the process of creating an online collaboration tool. It's called the Forum on Women, and it's women, religion, violence, and power, and it's very much geared towards this question, where people can just plug in. There are other such networking opportunities. I think the main point is to really think within yourself, what do you care about? Pick something that just really talks to your heart, and really dive in and go in for the long term. You know, try not to just dabble. You know, dabble until you find the thing. But human rights needs us all because it's actually quite in danger. We are really in danger of losing what President Carter described earlier as these global norms. We have normalized torture in our country because of Guantanamo and post 9/11. We have normalized indefinite detention. We have normalized violence against women. We are in danger. Warrantless wiretapping. We have the right to privacy is actually gone. Right?
The Fourth Amendment.
And without us really making much of a thing about it, right? So these are things that it's really time to wake up and get engaged in these and get a hold of it and don't let go. Yeah.
Lisa, what programs are active in the U.S. and other countries to educate young men so that there is a diminished market for prostitution and less acceptance of domestic violence, et cetera?
Not enough.
Yeah.
That's the real answer. I can give you a few organizations, but not enough. There are Men Against Violence, Men Against Domestic Violence. There are Boys and Men programs, but certainly not enough. And when a boy will look at me and say he wish he was a girl, that tells me that we have fallen down on this job. So the answer must be not enough. We need people to step up to the plate to answer the call. We can do only so much as women in terms of helping a young man become a young man. We need men to help do that process. Now, in lieu of that, until it happens, we will continue to fill that void. But we don't have the programs necessary. We don't have a shelter specifically for males who have been victims of trafficking. How do we say that is okay? Again, my answer is not enough. I would like to add this. I have learned that when I save one male, I generally, on average, save 3 to 4 girls. Because he will not go to try to profit off of her body. When I can put him in school, in a classroom, give him a support system, the mentors that are necessary, counseling if that's required as well, housing, food, and a part-time or full-time job, then he doesn't see it as a necessary evil for him to go and prostitute another girl, or sell another woman.
So earlier, President Carter said that when he was talking about racism, he said, whites benefited from it. He said that was why it was so hard to uproot. I wonder if we could kind of open this up for everyone to talk about some of the ways that men benefit from the dehumanization of women and how that impacts the difficulty in uprooting that in the society, the country, and the world.
I'm going to broaden that a bit.
Broader than the world?
No.
Broaden the men aspect, because I think that in a lot of societies, and I'll speak from my context of internationally in Southeast Asia, you can go through a village and kind of walk along the street and you see straw hut houses constructed with mud and different products from the environment.
And then you'll see this big white porcelain home with marble floors and lions at the entryway and a pickup truck, which is a big status symbol because of the terrain there. It helps you get around a lot better than a tuk-tuk. And in certain areas in the north, like when you see a house like that, you know that means that one of the daughters is working in Bangkok as a waitress. And that's socially acceptable and actually something that some girls, not knowing what their life will be like in Bangkok or Pattaya or any of these other beach town resort areas, they look forward to it because they see the girl that they used to look up to down the street has gone out of town to the big city and come back with money, and her family is doing better because of her, and they've built up levels to their house and they've upgraded their vehicles. And so it's a status, prestige. And so the onus also falls, on, of course, the men who are buying this, but also the families and the societies that glamorize and really admire status that's coming through these kind of unjust work systems. And so there's a lot to undo there because sometimes organizations such as yours that exist in these international contexts are made up of Westerners who come in from the United States or Europe or Sweden with our contexts of this is terrible, we need to end this, we need to save them. And they'll go right back to it, not because they love the work, but because they have an entire family of 50 people depending on that money. And so again, the economy and the structures, yes, they need to be in place, but even if in an ideal context you give paperwork and they're no longer Hill Tribe girls, they're now Thai citizens, and they can be saved from this by the authorities who, by the way, often just sit there and pretend that they don't see. I mean, there are police on every corner in these club areas, but they're just not doing what you might expect them to do. And you could have a 7-year-old girl doing backbends and dancing on a table outside of a club and a police officer 4 feet away. I have pictures of this kind of arrangement where you really seeing is believing. And when I give presentations with this, people are like, well, what's that officer doing? Well, not what you would assume, right? And so, but even if all of this was in place, there's always going to be another girl that they can replace her with. And so it goes deeper than the men buying the services. It also goes to the family contexts, the government support, the police officers or border officers, and who's getting paid off along the way. It's a very intricate financial network.
Can I add to that? So here in America, when I looked at that same problem, we learned that we had to go and unpack some family secrets. And no one ever wants to talk about those kinds of things. So our girls would often go home and call back and say, I can't live at home because they don't understand the new me. And they want me to be the old person because my mother was also a victim of this or abuse, and they don't know how to treat me. For instance, I'll call her Dee, and Dee was 12 years old. She was the first girl brought to me by the FBI, and she had been with us 9 months. And when she returned home, she had learned that she only was supposed to answer to her name, Dee. And when she returned home, they called her out of her name. And when she refused to answer them, and those who called her out of her name were her family members, she was faced with one or two things: to run away or to stay in a home and be abused there. And so it wasn't the men that we were dealing with having to sell, it was the family unit. And we had to go back and help mothers and fathers unpack some things and understand the trauma that their daughters or sons had endured, and understand what made them vulnerable and how they were perpetuating it in the family. Those things are very difficult to do because no one wants to be told that they have helped in the victimization of their child. And that's the work that we've been doing over the last few years. And because of that work and being very honest about it and having those conversations because they need to be had, we saw girls staying in homes much longer. So we got about a 67% rate of girls not running because now families understand who they are, how to act, and we've given them, like other organizations who do really good work, great support systems to help them navigate this thing. No one understands this thing that takes a hold of a child that has been sold or handcuffed and put in dog cages and sold on the market to the highest bidder. You don't understand what she's thinking or he's thinking every moment of the day. But when we can impart some of that knowledge, then that changes in the family dynamics, and they can keep our girls and boys safer.
I'll just add one to this, just because, just to put a cap on this rather pleasant conversation of all this human suffering. I think one that we don't talk about, it's so uncomfortable to talk about, is pornography, because pornography is actually bigger than the sex trade itself, the physical encounter. It is the biggest commerce, area of commerce.
It is certainly the gateway, for sure.
But what I mean
Absolutely.
is the amount of transactions
Certainly.
are more online than in person. And the statistics are terrible. People, mostly women, last 3 months in pornography until they're cast aside, until they have no, and it's become more and more violent. The more fringe, super hyper violent pornography has now become mainstream, and this is all available to 12-year-old boys on their phones.
And can we say girls too, because that's a growing market.
It is.
And we don't talk about that. I think when we have a conversation, we need to be very honest in the conversation. When we talk only men are the ones benefiting from children being trafficked, we must also say women are too. And we need to say that because when you know your husband, your son, your uncle, they're participating in this and you do nothing about it, you're a part of the problem as well. And we're not saying that out loud. We're not saying that women are traffickers as well. And we need to have those conversations if we're to ever truly protect our children. And yes, pornography is not just a gateway, but it is one of the largest moneymakers out there when it comes to boys and girls. We don't want to talk about it because our next door neighbor may be a person who is participating or buying that pornography. And that is uncomfortable for most.
Right, and we forget that the thing that's being filmed is an extremely violent thing.
Absolutely.
So it's the filming. I know a woman who is a survivor of prostitution. She says, thank God I was never filmed. She had a horrible experience. It was very violent. But she said, at least I was never on film. There's no record of it. But the girls, and mostly, and I say this mostly because the vast majority of those who are victimized are female. But males who, there's now the top porn king who came out and said he's now talking about how horrible of a life choice that was for him, how he regrets it. He's, in his 50s now. And so I'm only raising this because you asked about male privilege and male, sort of how do men benefit. And I think there is this idea that this is a form of entertainment. It really is way too normalized in our society. It's a form of entertainment. It's okay, it's fun, hey, hey, hey. But people are harmed, seriously harmed in this thing. And I would ask, that we think about that, because by participating, every time you click on that, someone is being harmed.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And money is exchanged. A profiteer is profiting. And I think this is a very concrete area that we could ask ourselves to challenge.
I know we have a lot more that we could say here, but we have a hard out for the C-SPAN audience. And so I want to invite Meredith Evans up to give her closing comments. But first, I want to thank everyone up here for participating.
Thank you very much. If the panel would stay a little, this dialogue is too good to let go, but we have an online audience and a C-SPAN audience we need to conclude with. So tomorrow we will continue this national conversation. It's about activism today, where we will probably address some social media that was mentioned here today. We have 3 wonderful emerging leaders speaking tomorrow, moderated by Maurice Hobson. So we're going to continue this conversation. So webcast and C-SPAN and my online community will be back tomorrow. For you here in the audience, I think we should continue this dialogue for a little while longer. There is hope, and I think knowing our rights and understanding civil rights and the human rights component that it leads to is of huge importance. So thank you, panelists.
So, Karin, I want to know if you wanted to weigh in on the question that was on the floor.
Male privilege.
About the ways that men benefit from the dehumanization of women.
So what becomes clear to me as I listen to this conversation is the extent to which, in addition to the decisions that men make that's harmful to our young ladies, there's a broader problem, which are those societal forces that reinforces or that gives legitimacy to the decisions that men make. Right? I really appreciate your point. You make reference to the family, and if I could just expand on the family concept and to broaden that to assume that we're discussing the societal family, this is the society as a family. So it seems to me as you were speaking, I'm listening and thinking about this very vicious cycle where you have a position of oppression that women occupy. Men benefit from that because of the social forces that are in play, in addition to the very illegitimate decisions that we make. Let's be honest, we sometimes make very conscious decisions about the actions that we will take. And then those actions then turn right back around and reinforce the social assumptions about the places that women should occupy and the places that are legitimately places of power that men should occupy. Of course, anytime we talk about cycles, it begs the next question: where is the break point? Where do you break that cycle? Where do you identify the weak point so that one could interrupt this process, right? So, but for me, I think, Jelani, the most obvious benefit that men garner is that the society in turn reinforces the positions that we can easily hide behind, right? We find ourselves able to say, well, it's this way because it's the way it is. Or women have always occupied this position, or here's one where we can say that, well, I did this because my dad did it, and my dad did it because my grandfather did it, and so on and so forth. Or this is all that I saw growing up in terms of the positions that women occupy. Unfortunately, we hear that contradiction most glaringly and most up front in some of the hip-hop dialogue. Yeah. Now, let's be clear, I'm a child of the hip-hop era, and I do not intend to chastise them unfairly. In fact, there was a point where they called me Freeze, right? In my b-boy days, right? So I don't mean to be hypocritical, but the point that I'm making is that what we tend to see is a kind of theme in the art form that says that I'm only talking about what I see in my community every day, and of course, what's folded in that is the way that we talk about women in the art form, and so that would be the way that I see this benefit. We benefit because the society deems it as such.
There's a question, I think I actually want to answer if it's okay. American exceptionalism is said to be the basis of dehumanizing the quote-unquote other. Please define the term and recommend how you teach Americans cultural competence to avoid dehumanization. I mean, that's interesting to me because I teach American history, and I disagree with the question to say that American exceptionalism is the basis of dehumanizing others. I think American exceptionalism is the product of this process of dehumanizing others, in that we've seen ourselves as an exceptional society. And I don't know, it's interesting because I grew up in a family in which you were discouraged from kind of self-praise. I think my father said self-praise is a half compliment or something along those lines. And so the idea that, that this constitutes an exceptional nation should be said by other nations, not by this one. And in fact, the focus on one's exceptionalism is the easiest means to ensure that anything that you did accomplish that was exceptional will be lost, that you'll no longer be able to accomplish those things. And so I don't think that American exceptionalism is the basis for it. I think it's a product of this process. But one of the other things that we should be mindful of is the ways in which our conception of ourselves as a group of people who are kind of outside of history, a group of people who are outside the normal ups and downs of the human existence, right, has been a disincentive toward confronting and challenging the actual concerns we have. And so I was talking with a French journalist, and he posed a question to me that said, this is a while back, he said, I'm interviewing people about this question about whether or not the the United States is still a role model among nations. And I said, what do you mean? A role model in the sense that we orchestrated Jim Crow and it became the basis for apartheid in South Africa? Or the role model in the fact that our racial policies were quoted and praised by Hitler as he created the Nazi regime? Or a role model in the sense that we have now allowed the use of torture? Or a role model in any of these things. And I say this to say, this is the oldest constitutional democracy in the world, and a institution that has enshrined the Bill of Rights that we're talking about today, but also tremendously flawed undertaking, as any human undertaking would be. And as our unwillingness to grapple with those tremendous flaws that allows them to persist in the present. And I think those are the things that we have to be mindful of. This dehumanization is something that is kind of implicit in our human abilities, the range of human personality. We know that. And what the effort of civilization has been is to remove that, to make ourselves one step removed from it. And there's a reason why all the great religions of the world have explicit reference to how one treats strangers. Because left to our own devices, we will hit the stranger over the head with the club. But we have to have these parables, and we have to have these surahs, and we have to have these religious edicts that tell us, don't hit the stranger over the head with the club, see the stranger as your brother and your sister. And hopefully after enough socialization to actually we begin to look at the world this way. And so I just took that question, so I guess I need to get another question.
That was great. That was great. That was great. That was perfect.
Was that perfect?
That was perfect.
All right, then I think we'll wrap up here.
That's good.
The cane here, she's come out and yanked us off stage. So thank you very much.
Thank you.